Welcome back to Imperium Art. This is episode 39. Our guest today is someone I had the pleasure of meeting on Tyler Hamilton's Euro Bureau of Literaturo, episode 22. He's been a long-time guest and contributor to EBL. He is editor-in-chief at firstness.org. He's teaming up with the Imperium Press, co-hosting the Imperium Cast. He has a passion for driving intellectual creativity and production for the dissident right. We are really excited to follow his new developments and pleased to have him on the show. Welcome, Joel Davis. How are you today, sir?
I'm really good. I'm glad to be on here.
Excellent.
I'm looking forward to having a conversation about something a bit different than political theory for the 100th time. So
Great, excellent. And so let me also introduce again my friend and co-host, the host of the White Art Collective's Poetry Cast, Conversations with the Wind. Welcome back, Nolles.
Hello, Donald, and hello, Joel, and hello to the audience. And let me just also mention that I listened to this first episode of Imperium Cast with Joel and Mike, and I strongly recommend it to everyone. It was a phenomenally interesting conversation. Mm-hmm. So welcome to our show, Joel.
Yeah, thanks. Mike's a great guy. Imperium Press is a really great organization, so I'm glad to be working with him and helping to promote all the work that they do, because I think what Mike has planned in terms of the kind of text they want to put out is brilliant stuff. It's really, I think it's really going to direct the movement in a positive direction.
Excellent. That's awesome. Yeah, we're looking forward to you kind of expanding on that a bit. We always advocate for people who are new to the show, new to our political and cultural sphere. So first off, if you could tell the audience who you are, what content you have produced and you are producing, and then at the end of the show we'll make sure people get links to follow you.
Yeah, so I guess to give you my little story, I started out on dissident right YouTube. There was a YouTuber many people might remember by the name of True Dill Tom. He and I became friends in real life, and he basically started a podcast with me that was relatively short-lived. Around that time, I was kind of getting into, I guess you could say, neo-reactionary type reading, but also postmodern philosophy at the same time. And so we were kind of attempting a little bit of a novel synthesis, combining those two things together, and promoting the ideas of generative anthropology, the work of Adam Katz, the so-called neo-absolutist project. You can read Dennis Bouvard's Anthropomorphics or Chris Bond's Nemesis, both available at Imperium Press, two of the first books they released, as expressions of that scene. And so that was kind of how I started, getting involved in this kind of stuff, was exploring those theoretical ideas, having those conversations. And I started my own YouTube channel. Dylan and I are no longer friends. He kind of went in a different direction. Everyone who followed him before has probably noticed he's rebranded. He doesn't so much really care about identifying as dissident right anymore, which is whatever, that's his personal prerogative. But I moved on. I started making YouTube channels, just exploring different ideas. I ended up becoming friends with Tyler Hamilton, as you said, and kind of co-hosted the Euro Bureau of Literaturo for a while, which was great. Tyler and I still have some stuff planned to do together in the future. So we're still good friends. I'm hoping that Tyler can write something for me, actually, for my new journal at firstness.org, which you mentioned, which I'm hoping to be kind of, shorter form writing is really important. Everyone doesn't need to write a book, and often writing a book is a very long and laborious process.
Right.
So I'm hoping that firstness.org can be a space where a lot of the best shorter form writing from our broad theoretical scene can kind of find a home. And then hopefully a lot of those guys ultimately end up progressing on the ideas that they establish in the books to write, in those essays, to writing a book one day or something, as kind of like an intermediary step. That's how I'm personally using it. So basically that's supposed to be a quarterly release at versus.org. The first release was a few months back, so the new one should be coming up towards the end of May.
Mm.
And so, yeah, working on that, obviously, the podcast with Mike that you guys mentioned, and just trying to be a voice. Like I have tried to have a kind of like a diverse interest field. So, and my view, we have to redesign the entire theoretical and structural basis of the right-wing worldview from mainline conservatism. So we have to provide a new economics, a new theory on law, a new geopolitical theory, a new theory on sociology, and ultimately we need to have a new history, like an entirely new historiography than what's been presented through the liberal lens. And I also believe we need to explore theological, artistic themes as well to kind of really contextualize what we're doing. So my project is about trying to facilitate the best kinds of discussion in all of these areas and try and make it all fit together.
Wow.
So
it sounds like we have a lot of work to do together in the future then in that case. I've been enjoying your shows, kind of refreshing myself a bit with it. Your YouTube channel is fantastic. There's also some interesting creative videography stuff that you've done in there as well. Are you looking to kind of go in that direction creatively, or what's your take on that?
Oh, I find the process kind of laborious and annoying. So I usually just record a Skype conversation and post
It's a lot
it.
easier. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I originally tried earlier on in my channel to kind of, and I had help from a friend, KYL. You might see this guy in the comment section of various videos across the dissident right. He helped me a little bit with editing some videos and taught me a little bit how to, my way around like Premiere Pro. Trudel Tom gave me a little bit of advice as well back in the day. He has really good videography skills, I think, as well. But I just really, it's such a long process that I was like, well, really what matters is the words that I'm saying, not really how it looks. So, and I didn't want to do these like short 10, 15-minute videos that like are YouTube friendly. I'd rather just do these like hour-long conversations. And so, I went in a different direction. But yeah, creatively, I mean, in terms of personally, like where I kind of find my point of connection to the artist is through music. Like I have, not that I have like put an album out or something, but I've like played different instruments throughout my whole life, and I love music and making music. And I've been in when I was younger, I was in some like semi-serious bands and things like this.
Wow.
The main instrument I play is guitar.
Yeah.
But and I like playing around like Ableton, making like electronic music or whatever. And
Sweet.
I've dabbled. I went to when I got out of high school. Actually, I spent some time studying music theory at university and things. So I have a little bit of a kind of experience with this aspect, and so like, and I know a lot about music history, music theory, and stuff. So I can understand from this angle. I'm not as passionate about things like painting or whatever, but I mean, I have a certain appreciation for it because particularly reading the work of Jean Gebser, because he was a personal friend of Picasso. I thought Picasso's paintings sucked, and I was like, I don't get why everyone loves this dude. Yeah. Then I read Gebser, and then I went to an art gallery and I saw some Picasso pieces, and I could appreciate it. Sure. And so I started to realize, you kind of need to know art theory to appreciate some of this stuff.
Correct.
I
have to jump in quick, though. I want to say that the White Art Collective, a lot of people are collaborating. So, I invite you to come on over and just, hang out, talk to different people, see who you, if you want to, if you're interested in making some music, working with other people, it's a fantastic network. And Imperium Art is very much a part of the White Art Collective network and family. We obviously promote and feature a lot of people from the White Art Collective on Imperium Art, naturally. So we love and respect you. Come on in and hang out and get to know some people. I think this could be an interesting new area for you. Especially if you're really trying to connect your political theory with the arts. I think it's through making the arts that all the machinations of that kind of come to light. It's not until you actually do something that something in a way. So that'd be exciting. And I remember you sending me some music. I forget what kind of music it was when we met earlier through EBL. We chatted a little bit about music, and you sent some really, really cool, some kind of an EDM electronic music. I forget the genre, but it'd be interesting to hear your original music.
Yeah, I would love to kind of get actually back into making music more because the last few years I've been so like focused in like reading books, which is kind of an
You got to
yeah,
bring balance back to the force there. That's what you.
yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I would say that I'm just really excited to see how that happens and how that grows. So,
This is
taking.
actually common in the movement as well, by the way. Sorry to cut you off. Like Mike, I don't know if you know, like Mike from Imperium Press was like has been in multiple bands in his life.
It's
He's like
very.
heaps into noise rock. I mean,
Yeah.
I mentioned Trudel Tom before.
Yeah.
That dude is an insanely good guitarist. Like
Mm,
he had like some like 8 string like
mm.
gent guitar type thing, and he would just sit in his room and it would just be like just shredding in there all the time when we lived together. And
Oh.
heaps of the guys in the movement, like I've that I speak to, people
Hmm.
that are in my circles or whatever, are like musicians or used to be in bands and stuff. So yeah, I do think there is a kind of like a strong kind of aesthetic resonance between a lot of the people. It's not just a political convergence, but it seems like a lot of people are really into very similar kinds of music, and
Yeah. I
which would
think.
make sense, right? It would make
Yeah.
sense that we would have like a certain aesthetic profile that combines all of our spirits together into a subculture. So
See, this is where I'm really, really keen on having you into the Imperium Art discussion, because I think that with both being a musician and a philosopher, it'll be fantastic to see how you work through these things, you make these connections, and then how that connects then to the community and the broader culture. So I strongly encourage that. I think that music also, you might agree, is one of the most accessible art forms. Is sort of a populist art form. Film is obviously too, short form videos and these things, but something about music, it's just, I think it's obviously consumed more than say painting or something like that. But yeah, so that there's a lot of potential there. So one of, if unless you want to continue on that thread about talking about your background, I wanted to also ask you the question we ask most of our guests, which is how did you come to your racial awakening? So white identity politics. What was it in your, what happened to you that made you kind of, put the dots together, so to speak, and figure it out, like what's going on in the world?
yeah, well, I mean, I think I could relate actually this answer to what you were saying about music. Why is music so interesting? Um, Music, is ultimately an aestheticization of time, right? Like it's obviously a
Yeah,
temporal medium.
yeah.
And I was watching a Mark Fisher. Now, Mark Fisher's a communist or whatever. But I was watching a Mark Fisher uh, lecture the other day on YouTube. He wrote the book Capitalist Realism, which is quite a popular book actually. He was a contemporary of Nick Land, I think back in the '90s in that CCRU scene. And Mark, his whole shtick with capitalist realism was this idea that like Western culture had basically lost the capacity not just to think outside of the terms of capitalism in terms of economic organization, but had kind of lost the ability to come up with new political ideas, new musical ideas, new
Mm,
um, creative ideas in general. And he was talking about how this is like this, and it's all he basically, he's a Marxist. He was kind of relating it back to capitalism as being this kind of spiritual vacuum that had sucked out our creative potential in various ways. And it's a very interesting book, even if you are from the right. I think there's a lot of ideas in there that are quite useful. It was actually, I think, one of the first books that EBL ever covered for this reason.
mm,
Um, so anyway, so he was talking about music, and he was talking about how, and this was, I think the lecture was about 10 years ago or so, maybe late 2008, 2009. Mark took his own life, unfortunately, rest in peace, a few years
oh,
after this. But he was talking about how, uh, you know, basically like he was talking about like the Arctic monkeys that in space, like when you listen to them, he didn't really hear that many ideas in their music that you couldn't hear in like the 80s or
Sure.
like the late 80s or something.
Sure.
And like he's like all the new music that's out today is just like these, like he was talking about like Lana Del Rey and various other artists that were like popular in the late 2000s.
Mhm.
How like he's like the ideas in this music is not really that interesting or innovative.
Mhm.
He's not trying to like, he's saying I'm not trying to shit on them, but like, you know, it's not like back in the 80s the stuff you're listening to, you couldn't imagine it existing in the 60s.
True.
And you know, so there's this kind of like cultural stagnation that had set in, and he said this was related to our inability to think the future, because music was ultimately like, you know, in the 80s the music that you listened to made you feel like, yes, we're in the 80s, and you could kind of like feel time progressing, 70s, 80s, 90s, whatever, through musical change. And this kind of aestheticization of time, you could feel it. It's kind of like drawing us into a future and a different kind of sensibility. And you know, obviously, music is quite related to politics and political belief. I remember when I was a kid, like, you know, 11, 12, 13 years old, listening to like bands like System of a Down or Rage Against the Machine or
Right.
you know, the Sex Pistols or whatever.
Yeah.
And this making me interested in left-wing politics because the music sounded so cool. They seem legitimately angry about something. Aesthetically, I can feel their anger, and so I'm going to
Yeah.
try and intellectualize what, you know, where's this music coming from? What's their
Mhm.
perspective? And I think a lot of people had this experience when they were younger, like developing political belief due to musicality. So when I was younger, I kind of started to explore left-wing politics, um, and then I remember I got into like anarchism. And I remember when I was in my kind of like mid-teens, I would go on like Reddit or like Facebook groups or whatever, anarchist discussion groups, and
Wow.
we would kind of like debate theory or whatever in a very rudimentary sense. And there was always an ANCAP faction, right, that would be in there arguing against like the communists or whatever.
Okay.
And I could like sympathize with some of the arguments of the communists, but the problem with the communists was that like, you know, they because like the anarchists had they were the first kind of group to have this like really hardcore third wave feminism, really like anti-white ideology. Like back in those days it wasn't like mainlined, you know, this is like, you know, the mid to late 2000s. It wasn't like a mainlined ideology yet, as it is today. You know, you kind of had a kind of more normal, you know, like gay marriage would be an unpopular position or something, or transgenderism was unthinkable as like a mainline position to be defending in those days.
Mhm.
And whereas like these guys, you know, were already like where the left is now on cultural issues back then. And so I started to become really pissed off. Like I couldn't make a joke, you know, without these leftists getting upset at me for being toxically masculine or something. And I was like, you know, I kind of agree with you when you criticize capitalism, but I don't get the whole feminism thing. Like it seems kind
Right.
of retarded.
Right.
So so I started to sympathize with the ANCAPs because the ANCAPs were kind of more sane, so
Sure.
like, you know, seemingly.
Yeah.
And so then I started getting into ANCAP philosophy, but it never quite sat right. And then, you know, it didn't take very long after this to kind of start, you know, finding things like Hopper and neo-reaction and all of these like proletarianism, which are kind of like, you know, limited worldviews, but they were kind of fascistic conduits away from
Yes. Yes.
libertarianism. So that's how I started looking towards the more extreme right-wing politics.
Mm-hmm.
And then around the same time, then the alt-right became something, and I started like, you know,
Wow.
watching videos on YouTube by alt-right YouTubers, or like, you know, listening to those like blood sports arguments on Andy Warski with like, you know, Nick Fuentes arguing for the ethno state and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I was, you know, got into 4chan. I always liked. It's funny. I always liked Hitler memes, even when I was like a nominal leftist. I used to
Really?
think Hitler was hilarious. Like these, like there was this one I remember on my Facebook page when I was like 16. I
Mm-hmm.
had the cover photo was like a picture of Hitler's face, and he's like in a suit, looking kind of like proud of himself, and it said, "Don't let." The caption was like, "Don't let what anyone tells you stop you from doing what you love or what you believe in," or
Oh,
something like this. And I thought that it was just hilarious because of how, like, you know, morally problematic it was.
sure.
Um, but so I was always drawn to the kind of 4chan meme culture and so forth. And so like because the alt right was so funny, it kind of began in this ironic way, or maybe you could say post-ironic way, and it was always poking fun at the left, poking fun at and being like enjoying racism as like a kind of something fun. Like we don't have to be serious about racism. We can like make jokes about it. This really appealed to me as a kind of comedic sympathy. Like, yes, like let's rebel against these rules as to like what we're allowed to laugh at in this way. This is kind of cool and interesting. And then it became more unironic as I started like, reading like Julius Evoler or like, FBI crime statistics or whatever. But yeah, so like that was kind of like my journey in a nutshell. But I guess the reason why I brought up music and the reason why I brought up memes at the end here is because I was just trying to emphasize how I don't know if this journey would have actually occurred if it wasn't for music. Like I'm very much into extreme metal, like into black metal. I used to watch Varg videos for the same reasons, because I liked Burzum and Mayhem or whatever. Okay. And the kind of the aesthetics of death metal, like I listen to like a Slayer album or something, and it's like the kind of performance art of taking the kind of the extreme right-wing position or whatever, even though obviously Slayer is doing it in this kind of really kind of retarded way, in a way. Like obviously there wasn't really an angel of death doing these medical experiments or whatever, but I was kind of drawn to this kind of dark outside, this aesthetical outside of what was kind of presented within the neoliberal stack of acceptable positions. And so I think, yeah, like music and comedy or memes or whatever really were able to give me a space to experience pre-intellectually a different kind of sensibility, which corresponds roughly to the dissident right, that kind of drew me into actually trying to intellectualize and formalize that experience. And so that's why I think art, is so central actually to the political process. Like if we created the coolest music of the next 10 years, all the, all the coolest new music that all the kids are into was created by a bunch of, dissident right sympathetic individuals, the kids would end up on our side, because they would want to explore those themes, much like the same thing happened to me with communists. And when I was a kid, and I think, obviously, our memes are also doing the same thing, where like people begin just kind of posting and laughing at certain memes, and then all of a sudden they're actually like reading texts and listening to new kinds of media, and their political opinions are kind of transforming. So
fantastic. Let me give the mic to Nullis for a bit here and see if he wants to respond.
No, this was a phenomenal explanation of someone's path to what we would call the awakening, or whatever the current terminology is for that. But suffice it to say, this is an interesting point about presenting a very unapologetic and very profound message to the public, to the youth in particular, and that's where we always have this issue. Where we question ourselves many times as artists: how far can we take it? How cutting edge are we, in fact? And also, how bold should our message be? Should we care about optics? Should we not care about optics? Who is it that we're appealing to? Are we appealing to the normie tier boomer Gen X generation? Are we appealing to the young generation? It's a completely different message depending on who it is that we're trying to reach out to. So these are a lot of questions that we constantly, and Donald, you can underscore this, I'm sure, that we have these discussions all the time in terms of where we place our message and how we share our message with the audience. And I think this is an important question, because if we try to accommodate the people that we're trying to reach out to, then we're making compromises in our art. But at the same time, we have to be careful, because we're living in a situation, a society right now that strikes very hard down upon us if we go beyond certain boundaries, or if we break certain boundaries. But then again, in the past, many artists didn't care about the boundaries. They said, no, I want to break all boundaries. So how do we balance this? And that's, to me, one of the most important questions going forward in terms of messaging.
It's strange because I think we think of the quote rebellious artist or rebel music as deconstructing society, but we're the new rebels and we're reconstructing society. We're trying to rebuild Western civilization as it's being shattered. And in a way, I believe that perhaps the arts have some distance or plausible deniability or something whereby it can go viral, but also not be as how do I say censored as much as, say, just shit posting, putting out memes.
Well, I think, Donald, sorry to interrupt you, but we've had artists in the past, just in the past few, 4 or 5 years, who have been viciously attacked and deplatformed, and not only that, but for relatively minor issues, were forced to basically denounce their whole position legally. And so, it is a very difficult time that we're in. So we have to be cognizant of this reality, but then at the same time, we should not hold back either. So it's a tough one.
Sure, there's definitely dimensions of that. Like, for example, life in the UK right now, I think, is hell for people in our movement and for artists,
Right.
especially. But what I guess I'm saying is that the music itself, it's almost like a kind of a spaceship that we can plant our message in and shoot off to the stars, and it reaches a lot more people just through the joy of music and these kinds of things. So, and that's just one art form. So it's something I would encourage a lot. I really feel that, speaking to Joel's points here about the aestheticization of time and music, etc. The White Art Collective does have creators who are doing this. They haven't been recognized in like a large format by music critics and these kinds of things, but people within the White Art Collective, we're very aware. If you look at Hyrith's music, Olivia Key, For Null, and you pay attention to their music, their aesthetic, their message, it's happening. They are doing these things. And there's other musicians as well, other creators as well. But I think that we're right on the cusp of this. This thing is it's growing legs and it's moving along. So this is a really good time for this discussion with Joel.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
So there's a point that I wouldn't mind bringing in here, actually, which is, I remember when, again, referring back to an old EBL episode, we read, I can't remember which text it was, but Walter Benjamin was the author, who is the kind of father of critical theory. And he, at the end of the text, started like throwing shit at the futurists, the Italian futurists, and because obviously he's an anti-fascist, right?
Right.
And he was talking about how the left needs to respond, and he's writing in like the 1930s, right? He's talking about how the left needs to respond to the so-called aestheticization of the political with the politicization of aesthetics, and this is the difference, I think, between what we, so to speak, would do and what the left has done is this kind of politicization of aesthetics. It's like this to me is kind of like detestable in a certain way, because it's like you're kind of beginning, okay, here's my ideological message, I'm going to shove down the throat of the audience. I'm going to like infuse it into the aesthetics of what we're doing, and then as a kind of like a parasite or a kind of co-traveler. Whereas like the beauty of futurism and fascism, dare I say, was that it was about seeking beauty in the political, right, and having a kind of aesthetic view. So instead of needing to be, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that we can be kind of subtle in a very powerful way. So like I described before, listening to extreme metal, I mean, to me, whether or not, I mean, it's irrelevant whether the actual individual artists that make up the death metal or the black metal scene, what their politics is, because the aesthetics of brutality, of I guess like warrior consciousness, so to speak, The kind of the spirit of Odin and the spirit of Thor, so to speak, were being expressed through that music, whether they realized it or otherwise. And to find this beautiful is to, in a certain sense, rebuke liberalism in a certain sense, because it shouldn't be beautiful to the liberal, this kind of expression of, and also it's rigorous. Like you listen to like an extreme death metal album, and it's like it's actually musically complex. It's actually, the composition of it is masterful. They're kind of recreating all of these components of like neoclassical music or whatever with like the instruments of rock and roll, which is crazy in and of itself. And so like the extremeness and the complexity and so forth, it gives itself over to a very kind of autistic, masculine kind of approach. And so it doesn't surprise me that when I talk to people on the dissident right, that it seems like almost universally they're fans of extreme metal, because there's like this kind of aesthetic resonance. The kind of aesthetic consciousness that it opens up is the same kind of consciousness that would be necessary to explore intellectually or more formally a lot of the themes of our movement. And so I think this is the approach. The reason why Pepe memes are so good isn't because they're right wing; it's because they're funny. Like they're actually funny, and like yes, they happen to also be right wing, but more importantly, they're funny. And the thing is that we have genuine aesthetic ideas in comedy or whatever that we have to express, that we don't need to like we don't need to force our ideology down the throat of the recipient. We can just express ourselves naturally. This is who we are. These are the things that we feel and experience, and through self-expression of the genuine themes that we're wrestling with in our own lives and in our society. What comes out of that is our sensibility that we can invite others to share in. So
that's beautifully stated. That's really nicely stated. Nullis has this concept. You'll have to help me paraphrase this. Artistic violence. I believe it's in the Imperium Art essay. Is that correct, Nullis?
Yes. So I have basically two sections that I have in the essay, and they sort of build upon each other. And one is the section of cognitive dominance in the culture insurgency, and then the dialectics of artistic violence, which is then ultimately expressed through the warrior poet ethos. And I think, but we can get into that later. Yeah, but that's kind of what those two sections are discussing.
I feel like this relates directly to what Joel just said.
It does.
Right. And that liberals view violence as peace if it serves their ends. They think, but if we express our anger and our frustration in a sort of violent music of, say, black metal, it's terrifying and threatening. And,
Well, maybe, Donald, if I can quickly interrupt, I would say that to the liberal, violence means destruction. And that's because for them it's destructive, and because they're individuals who are by nature, if you want, or by definition, maybe better, by definition, destructive people, as opposed to constant revolution. Revolution is destructive, tearing down the old, building the new. These are all liberal thoughts, and so if you want to take the more traditional pre-liberal thought, violence was meant as a means to defend what you built. It was there for the constructive soul to protect what they have. It was a definitely different kind of mentality, and violence was unapologetic, because if I'm defending what it is that I've created around me, my family, my city, my nation, and all of these things, these are meant to glorify my position and why I'm doing what I'm doing, and there's no excuse, there's no apologies for my violence.
Yeah, I guess.
And Joel, correct me if I'm wrong, by the way, if you have a different opinion on that.
So I'm essentially pointing out the different perspectives of violence within art and culture. One, I guess, supposedly, if I'm interpreting this right, perhaps on the right, maybe it's creative, whereas on the left it's destructive. So, right, I suppose that wraps that. But
well, if you want to talk about cinema, to branch off from music as well, I mean, my favorite kinds of movies are basically gangster films, but also like, excuse me, anything like kind of like neo-noir or whatever as well. which doesn't necessarily preclude being a gangster film, but usually it deals with crime in some way, right? These kinds of films, to me, they're always kind of the question of violence, not glorifying or castigating violence, but the fact that we have violent potential, and this is a morally complex. Like there's always an anti-hero, and there's a kind of morally complex situation that doesn't really have a clear good, bad, right, and wrong kind of distinction drawn down the middle of it. And to me, this expresses something incredibly real about the human condition, which is that um, there is no like easy moral answer to the things that are most important. And generally, one of my most favorite films of the past few years, and we actually did an ECL episode on this actually, which is the movie The Gentleman by it's a Guy Ritchie directed film. It came out a couple of years ago.
Right.
And it had a very clear racial subtext. Like it seems as though Guy Ritchie is red-pilled and based on, he's on the Chans or whatever. But
cool.
But even just beyond that, which was enjoyable in itself, was the way that it expressed the anti-hero, because the main characters are gangsters, but they're incredibly morally likable. Like they express all kinds of moral restraint. But at the same time, they're gangsters. So it's like, well, you guys are clearly kind of outside the good life in a kind of in on one sense, but in another sense, there's a way of respecting you in a very profound way. You kind of set your own rules, but you set them with a certain dignity, and there's a self-limitation and a discipline in how you guys live your life. And this I think is a beautiful thing. And this is really, I think, dealing with the theme of masculinity, that like ultimately our culture is really kind of losing a way of narrating explicitly, which is that when you're taking the position of the father, when you're taking the position of the guy in charge, if you think about this not in the familial sense, but also the political sense, there isn't like easy moral decisions. Like you can't just have some basic moral code and like run an empire, because you have to fight wars. You have all these different factions. You're playing off one another, and your job is to maintain order and protect your people. And that means you have to make tough decisions. And sometimes it means you have to go outside the bounds of what would make everyone comfortable, or what maybe would be the most popular or like defensible position. And you have to make, and I think this is reality. This is the real of masculinity. Right. And anytime this gets expressed, I think it really does, problematize these like clean liberal distinctions of, or this kind of illusion that we can have this like nice government, this nice power structure that protects everyone's rights and does everything according to science, and it protects you and your family, and like. This is retarded. This is not actually how the world is. Like actually, the name of the stream, Imperium Art, like the Imperium is morally problematic.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And so, note to self: get Guy Ritchie on Imperium Art. This is beautifully stated. That it's funny because the next question is something we've already dove into, but I'll ask it anyway to give some focus. What is or should be the relationship of art and culture to politics, and why? How does this position apply to the culture of white identity politics? And I think this would be something that'd be very beneficial for the White Art Collective specifically, because we are the creators. I think we're we're leading in this area, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would probably push back on this idea of kind of taking this hegemonic label of white identity politics, because yes, of course, this like race is important and all of this kind of thing, but I feel like there's more going on in our movement than just racial consciousness. I think this is just one component of a series of realizations. But the role of art, I mean, as I was saying before, I think, ultimately, I mean, if you want to get a little theoretical, my view, I wrote about this in my paper in firstness.org, and I took a lot of this from the work of Gilles Deleuze, this kind of distinction that I drew between rationalization and what I call dramatization. And so like the example that I gave in the paper was, if I gave you like a definition and tried to rationalize that definition with some kind of set of arguments about how to be graceful, or I hand you a Bible and say, go read the Gospels. Like, what are you, which is the dramatization of the theme of grace, you could say, in many ways. Obviously, there's more going on there than just this, but it's one of the central themes. What are you going to learn more about grace from? Are you going to learn more about grace from me giving you a dictionary definition and then some kind of rational argument, or from the life of Christ and its dramatization of grace? And so I think ultimately, and I related this to kind of counterpose the definition to this, what I call the situation. And I said the situation is composed of themes and drama, and meaning is essentially has this infinite iterability in this space. Whereas, like, if you condense meaning to the definition and its rationalization, you kind of cut off all of these relational aspects to of how meaning is actually conveyed, which is why myths are a thing, and why they continue to be a thing in modernity, even though we have this supposed rational way of seeing the world. Like, mythology is still alive and as strong as it ever was. And this is because there's meaning isn't just conveyed in this vulgar sense. There's meaning is very complex. And the most complex themes, if you want to talk about anything that is really profound, like, I said, grace or love, or the kind of, as I said before, the kind of moral ambiguity of the anti-hero in like a neo-noir film, it's because there is no just book we can write of rational definitions that can give us the answers on all these questions about how to live our lives. We actually need the drama. We need a kind of complex expression to reveal these themes, and these are things that require like a persona and a performance to truly understand. And so this is why art has such a major role in political consciousness, because, like I was saying before about memes, like if you look at like the Wojak meme, for example, this is a great example of what I'm talking about. The Wojak meme has become this like conduit of social commentary. There's so many different Wojaks that represent all these different kind of social personas, and some of them are kind of critical, some of them are kind of glorifying, and some of them are both at the same time in this post-ironic way. We can like criticize the boomer, but also positively depict the boomer with the same Wojak in certain depictions and relations with other Wojaks or whatever. And this is able to convey really complex information that, like, if we just wrote something in words about what we were trying to, we get into an argument online, and I make an argument, is in certain sense, there's no argument I can make more powerful than just posting a soy jack underneath someone's comment, or there's no way you could agree with me better than just like reposting what I said with a giga chad, because you're aestheticizing and thematizing the meaning of what's being communicated, and so you're expressing something that is too complex. There's too many different non-linear relations going on here to kind of condense it to this pure script. And I think and I think this is this is just how meaning works. And I think, and so politics is no different. There's a kind of non-explicit tacit dimension to the political. I remember always thinking when I was younger, even though the Nazis were supposed to be these big bad guys that are like, the demons of history, I remember thinking, man, their uniforms are pretty cool, and swastikas look kind of nice. I'll draw one on my, in the back of my textbook at high school or something, because it looks cool. Yeah, because it was expressing something. It was expressing something that I didn't fully understand in words. But it was drawing upon these these themes that are thousands of years old, that go back to like Indo-Aryan identity and all this kind of stuff.
Huge, yeah. I always say that our enemies don't get to tell us what our indigenous symbols mean, and I feel like it's just so important to say that and get more information out about those things. That's going off on a separate conversation. But what I'm taking away from what you're saying here is that art, in some sense, has to have a kind of a theater to it, through which the viewer the consumer of art is having living vicariously through the theater, and that creates a psychological transformation in them in some sense. So, and I wanted to just kind of like a little bit of a reveal. I'm actually helping to launch a new comic book company called New Delphi Media, where all these memes that we know in the social media political world, I've designed them into various superheroes and supervillains, and I'm like 75 pages deep into this graphic novel, and I'll be live streaming some stuff with that in the future. So it should be exciting to take the meme culture into the comic book culture and then see where that goes. Hopefully obviously you could imagine the Wojak having a comic book, and an actual narrative that it gets larger and more expansive and deals with these things. So anyway, that's a pretty interesting concept. Nullis, do you want to grab the mic?
Oh, no, just continue.
Yeah, it's really, really great listening to you. You're super articulate. Yeah, that's kind of your superpower, is you're so well at articulating these concepts here. So I do want to jump back a little bit. You were saying you want to do a little bit of a pushback on the concept of white identity politics being a hegemony of some kind. Could you expand on that a bit?
Well, obviously I feel loyalty to my race, and I acknowledge obviously that white people are being like systematically attacked by the political system, and it's clear that a kind of subtle genocide is occurring in all of this. So I don't see I'm not like against white identity politics as like having truth. It has truth, but I just don't think that organizing on the basis of identifying with one another in terms of our race is really the most profound moral basis for political identity. I think ultimately we need a spiritual identification with one another. We need to understand ourselves as partaking in a spiritual mission given to us by divine forces, not simply. I think you see, particularly in the earlier phases of the alt-right, a lot of this kind of Darwinist-ish, biological essentialism, talking about, biologically what's different about whites than other races, and obviously there are biological differences, but and then trying to create an entire political worldview out of this. I find this to be kind of spiritually debilitating, and I think this is not how white people traditionally saw themselves. White people traditionally saw themselves as ultimately, like if you go back in Anglo-Saxon history or something to the formation of the British Empire, we believed that the king or the queen was appointed by God, and that we had a spiritual mission that would basically define world history given to us by the creator of the universe. We didn't simply just believe that we have a high time preference because of our genetics or something, and to me this is a far more profound way of thinking about ourselves, and it has a lot more. I think it has a lot more to do with why we've found ourselves in this position today, like the secularization of the political, the kind of unplugging of the Western subject sense of self from his history, from any kind of theological grounding, from our ancestral traditions and so forth. I think this process of disconnection is kind of like what has weakened us and our kind of civilizational immune system to all of these terrible ideas. And to really fix it, I think it requires a lot more than just banding together on the basis of being white people or whatever. Because and I also do think that there are non-whites that could be potential allies and friends, and there are whites that are obviously enemies. And so
Right.
I think this needs to be entertained in some fundamental way. I mean, even the Nazis had honorary Aryans, that were non-whites that fought alongside them and died alongside them. So that's my kind of nuanced view, I guess you could say.
I'm sorry, I brought up this concept of a Western alliance, on the basis of being Westerners, that we created Western civilization and any non-white or biracial person who lives in it and enjoys it should be an ally to protect it from specifically communism, but obviously any other kind of thing. This is an exciting concept. I think that the topic you're talking about secularization killed the Western spirituality per se, is something that the White Art Collective and people in the general movement need to focus a lot on. We have talked about it. It's obviously in our conversations and what's going on. There's debates about, well, theology, religion, spirituality, where do we all stand? We disagree, we agree that, but to make that the centerpiece though, rather than the scientific data, about like the bell curve and, the relationship between crime and DNA and, these various things between races, that I think could perhaps be the place we want to evolve towards, to get this on a spiritual level rather than a secular scientific level. I find the scientific data extremely empowering, and I've wielded it to lop off the heads of numerous leftists in like social media debates and things like that. But I think that's fine and well. It's not changing things per se to our people in a broader sense. Spiritual, how do I put this? Having a spiritual root in this and having a sense of being Westernkind, and that's a spiritual concept. Westernkind. It's both biological and spiritual and historic in a way as well. So, I find all this stuff really, really important, but I feel like we as a movement and, we as content creators have to discuss it more, define it more, and obviously create art about it more. So that's something I certainly try to do in my own visual art and in my music as well. Nullis, would you like to jump in?
Oh, absolutely. This one, what Joel said, I agree with 100% on everything he said. And I believe that the big problem that we have is when we talk about an overall, well, let me backtrack a moment for a second. It kind of reminds me of this analogy of the sorcerer versus the mystic, if you will. The sorcerer wielding illusions, creating false realities around you, and the mystic who's presenting truth through his metaphysical connection. And so what we want to achieve is to represent that mystic sensibility, that the mystic soul, the connection to the metaphysical that I believe has been severed in our history, going back centuries, actually. But I don't want to get into that aspect of it. More to the point of, the white identity as in and of itself alone is an important theme. But in my personal view, it's not enough. It just defines us for what we are. It does not define us for who we are. And so we need to focus on defining ourselves spiritually, morally, and also culturally, and understanding all of these connections and threads that bind us together. And that, in my opinion, and I agree with Joel, that has to be done through some kind of overarching metaphysical theme. It doesn't happen through a biological understanding. Now, how we define this is really the interesting point, this overarching metaphysical theme, because there are different faiths, there are different schools of thought on this. I personally would take a Catholic approach to this, where I would argue that, for example, Christianity, in particular, the Catholic faith, is inherently European. It's a religion that was created by the Europeans for the Europeans. And as it expanded because of the concept of trying to civilize those peoples around them in the hope of finding peaceful coexistence. And in some cases, it might work. So that's where these alliance questions might come up. And you might also have other peoples that don't belong to your particular metaphysical reality, who you might have other connections to, or that you respect each other enough so that you can find some kind of alliance. But alliances are very tricky also. Alliances always change. alliances are always based on interest. And so, for me, the most important question, more than alliance, is to really clean house, to fix our problems, to fix our own backyards first before we can do anything. Because if we present ourselves as weak, then we have nothing to really offer, if you will, if you want to put it that way. But more importantly, it just leads us nowhere. It takes us down this nihilistic path that we've been going on for probably about over 300 years, if you ask me. But again, this is a very broad topic, and we could go on and on about this for several hours. But I fully agree with what Joel said, and I think that what he said is very important, and it's something that we need to ponder on, focus on, and try to also find ways to articulate it artistically as well.
Which is what the Imperium Art project is all about. So I think we've made a lot of headway on this show. So let me move on with the next question then. Joel, if you were asked to write a manifesto for artists in the white identity political sphere, what would some of the guidelines or parameters be?
Just like before I get into this, I just as a little aside to the kind of conversation that we just had, which contextualizes what I want to say about this, is that we live in a kind of irreversibly globalized world in terms of technological integration. And so this means that we don't really have a choice, but either to be kind of decimated by the political forces that are against us, or to not just sort ourselves out, but lead the world in a really fundamental way, and to just set the paradigm for how international politics works, and who is permitted and who isn't permitted, and how they're permitted to exercise sovereignty over their territories. And right now there's a situation where basically you have these, maybe you could say, these various power centers. You've got, I guess, the Russians, the Chinese, the kind of Islamic world, and I guess you could say the EU. These are like the four power centers of Eurasia. They have complicated relationships with one another, and we need to we can't really afford to have World War III, because all of these groups have nuclear weapons, and other kinds of advanced weapons technology, and so we basically need to have a world in which we can kind of get along in a certain, not like sing kumbaya around the fire, but some kind of like pragmatic solution to cohabitating in the same planet. And so a certain amount of international political organization is necessary. And I think the Russians are a very impressive culture and people. And it will always take a certain level of leadership in this regard as well. But basically, I think it is the task of the Americans primarily, along with the Russians, to kind of set the tone for the international order. I think these are the two truly imperial peoples on the earth. And these are both Christian nations, in problematic ways alike, but nevertheless in the most fundamental sense. And so I think there needs to be a very serious coming to terms of theology, politics, and international relations in order to actually figure out what's the 21st century going to look like. And if we mess it up, the consequences are going to be disastrous. Like, forget, concerns about, mundane concerns about, local politics. I mean, this is in terms of the future of the human race and our capacity to survive into the future, and under what form and what relation to increasingly scary technological possibilities. I was reading an article the other day about a Jewish scientist who was essentially developing technologies to grow rat embryos in artificial wombs, and trying to get funding and approval to do it with human embryos.
I'm aware of it.
Yeah. So this is just one aspect, but a kind of a future in which governments, institutions create people instead of families is a future that we might actually be facing in our lifetime, which is just really terrible to think about. So with that being said, in terms of artistic themes. I mean, I didn't mention sci-fi so far, but I do think in terms of coming to terms with our own power as a species in terms of technology and what this means. This is a perennial theme that I think we need to deal with. And our movement has a lot of kind of critical analysis of technology and technological society that is kind of embedded in our scene. But I think this needs to be expressed artistically. I think art is one of the best ways to kind of explore morally technology, and this is why sci-fi is. There's a lot of cringe sci-fi, but when it gets it right, there's some really incredible works of cinema and literature and so forth in this genre for good reason. But in the more general sense, I mean, I think what I was saying before about the aestheticization of time, two incredible authors, Oswald Spengler and Jean Gebser, which I believe should be kind of understood and read together. I was influenced by John David Ebert into kind of becoming aware of and really kind of delving deep into both of these authors. And he believes the same thing. And with Spengler, you have this model. I mean, Spengler's well known on the dissident right, but you have this model of every great civilization going through this 1,000-year arc of what he calls initially a culture phase and then ultimately a civilization phase, where you have this unique spiritual idea that is this entirely new way of relating to divinity, which forms a kind of theological realization that launches a civilization. And there's all these new forms of art, all these new forms of architecture and social organization that kind of explode out of this theological novelty. And this creates the fundamental character of a civilization and gives it the power, like the spiritual power upon which it can construct itself. And ultimately it then develops novel philosophies, theories of political organization, economic organization, technological organization, and so forth, and becomes a genuinely distinct historical civilization, creates massive metropolitan centers, and then ultimately goes through this period of decadence, degeneracy, and collapse. And so you have this model of history, and we're kind of, obviously, the book's called Decline of the West for a reason. We're in this kind of, we're kind of, our civilization, he dates back to the 13th century. So we're kind of heading into the final phases. And so this is kind of like blackpilling in a certain sense, you could say. But then you have the work of Jean Gebser, who you could see as a kind of like a response to Spengler. And Gebser, instead of seeing things in terms of civilization by civilization, he has these theories of what he calls consciousness structures in the history of humanity. And so he describes how we, if you look at the anthropological record, there's a lot of evidence for this kind of like what he calls magical consciousness. I don't want to go through a whole exposition on Gebser's theories. But you have this very primitive magical consciousness, then you have mythological consciousness, out of which the first great civilizations are constructed, where you have this kind of grandiose mythological system that integrates the kind of civilizational process into a kind of complex thematic drama that kind of articulates all these different social roles. There's corresponding deities and spirits and so forth, as opposed to the simplicity of native Aborigines or Native Americans, which are far more magical than mythical. They have myths, but they're a lot more visceral. And then ultimately you have what he calls rational consciousness, which he believes kind of began, in what Karl Jaspers calls the axial age, around 600 BC in like ancient Greece. And he sees a fourth consciousness structure emerging in the late 19th century in the West, which he calls integral consciousness, which he sees as the kind of opening of rational consciousness to mythical and magical sensibilities in this kind of integral field. And he sees it as analogous to essentially the temporalization of space. He says the rational worldview is incredibly spatial. If you look at like ancient Greek art, you have the most obvious thing you could probably that brings up in your mind when you think of ancient Greek art is the statue. The statue is this kind of, it has no background. It's just kind of like suspended in nowhere, exactly. it lacks a kind of a temporality. It is this pure expression of space, kind of imminent to itself. And he says what occurs in the 19th century, and then he says, this reaches its kind of final phase in like what he calls perspectival art, like early modern art. Early modern art, where you have portraiture, like the kind of the realism of portraiture and landscape painting. And he says in the 19th century with like Impressionism, and I'm not like a hyper nerd on the history of art, but with these new artistic forms that come online, you particularly see this in like surrealism or something, is the total rupturing of the realism of spatial perspective, and instead a whole new kind of abstract position on perspective, what he calls aperspectivity, where we can kind of communicate a kind of temporalization or a kind of thematization of perspective in a radical new way that previously was not possible in human art. There's no kind of corresponding relation to this. And so if you look at like a Salvador Dali painting or something,
right,
he's not painting something that you can physically see, but he's painting something that means something. And so there's this it's not a perspective you can take on the world, but it is something more complex than this. And at the same time, you have phenomenology, Bergson, all these basically Heidegger coming along in philosophy, which are kind of temporalizing the subject, temporalizing consciousness with their theories. And then you have Einstein temporalizing space with his with relativity. And so you have all these different corresponding innovations in the late 19th, early 20th century that express this new mode of consciousness that Gebser is describing. This is kind of countervailing to the idea that we're just in this civilizational decline. Like our civilization has nothing new to say, has nothing new to express. We've already had our Kultur period and it's all over. This is supposed to be this nihilistic age, and in many ways it still is, of decadence and decay, of no new ideas, and that's it. We're done. But Gebser brings hope to the situation and says, hey, wait a second, this period when we were supposed to be moving into this civilizational nihilism, we're creating all of these new modes of science, art, culture, etc. And this shows that there's still life. There's still life in us.
Oh yeah.
And so I think leaning into this, and particularly, I referenced this in the first episode of the Imperium cast, the work of Heidegger. A lot of these names I'm bringing up, like Dali was a supporter of Franco. Obviously, Heidegger was a Nazi. It's interesting. A lot of these figures in this movement are kind of were sympathetic to futurism, sympathetic to fascism, and so forth. And Heidegger criticized the kind of Cartesian, subject, which is kind of like locked off to time. It's kind of it's like the beginning point. Through the cogito, the Cartesian subject is kind of like an omega point for metaphysics, and he kind of completely castigates this and opens up. He says the subject doesn't exist unto itself, but only it can exist within a history that it is thrown into, within a culture that it is immersed in, and it finds itself already within. And so he kind of temporalizes the subject and shows how there is this like wealth of time, this wealth of process behind us, like kind of like pushing us into being and revealing things to us and within us and so forth. And so he kind of opens the subject up to all of these forces and kind of destroys the kind of Cartesian paradigm, which I argued in the Imperium cast. One was essentially like the metaphysics of liberalism, this idea that the subject has rights reposited in his own being, and like you can have this logic now where you can have 4-year-olds deciding what their gender is, as though there's some kind of consent or individuated will located within the subject that defines us in this most originary sense. Heidegger's philosophy completely obliterates this view and says no, our self-awareness is constructed within a tradition, and this is inescapable. And so this, I think, is analogous to the opening of rational consciousness to the mythos in particular, and to this pre-rational drama this pre and the kind of femitization of consciousness and so forth. I think this is really what I see our job as being, which is like opening up, the consciousness of a decadent and nihilistic West to the source of its meaning, to
Beautiful.
theological and historical themes that have participated in our self-construction, whether we're conscious of it or not. And becoming conscious of it is, for Heidegger, ultimately the path towards authenticity for Western man.
Beautiful.
So I think this would be like the fundamental basis of what I see the role of art being. So I don't know if that's a good answer.
Oh, that's phenomenal. I mean, there's a lot to unpack. I think what we need to do though is to like parse it out into, bite-sized pieces for the masses to consolidate or condense all that into something that could be like a mantra that artists can think about and dwell on, muse on while they're in the studio making their work. I urge people in the arts to listen to this episode maybe a few times, or even just this part of the episode, so that so that we internalize these messages. Joel has brought to us, he has, through his brilliance, he's kind of taken all of this information and pieced it together into, I guess, maybe a pre-manifesto per se of what we need to be aware of. And then we as artists, it's our job then to produce artwork, culture, to, then stimulate our people into this awakening. So again, there were so many things that you covered in there, but something I'd like to respond to is you brought up sci-fi, and that's close to my heart to begin with. But look at most of the sci-fi that we seem to see. A lot of it is dystopian. The end. This future end of the world and how people survive it, and then terrifyingly, we're actually there. We see these things right around the corner. So it's occurring to me, maybe that was not only prophetic, but maybe we manifested it, subconsciously or superconsciously in some way. And then perhaps we as a people need to start creating like white pill science fiction, science fiction that envisions the Imperium, and what a beautiful world it is, where we have full sovereignty, full control of our destiny, that we don't, there's no more parasites in our world, yet we coexist with, other nations, cultures, religions around us in a productive way. So, that obviously is totally against the communist narrative, the leftist narrative, it's quote white supremacy. But that's actually the heart of what we want, is to live at peace and prosperity and unmolested by all these parasitical entities, in and around our civilization. So what I'm looking at is to try to take everything you just said and put it into a sentence or two. So I don't know if that's easy to do or possible to do.
Donald, I got it.
Go for it.
The Holy Roman Space Empire.
It had to be Catholic, didn't it?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, responding to what Joel was saying, that is, I mean, you talk about the 13th century and how there was a spiritual root, man's relationship to God, and then look at, I read an article today about how it would take like 100 so many years to visit every castle in France, and I'm thinking, wow, look at all the churches, all the cathedrals. That is, that's the civilization that we have in the West. And it's obviously very much a part of who we are. But I suppose, history is accelerating. It's almost on a spiral at this point, where with technology specifically, and then with all this kind of Zionist communist infiltration that is, our government has been stolen in the United States, that we're in a very terrifying age right now. So the end may be closer than what we think. But I always see the end as the beginning of a rebirth of some kind. And so I feel like these are the most critical questions that our people need to be facing right now. And I'm just extremely grateful to Joel, and his talent to be able to digest all this stuff. But I think we still need to, crystallize it even more, turn it into something simple like what Nullis said. That works for a lot of people. There's a lot of other people, though, right? In our movement, there's a lot of sort of diversity of thought, religious orientations. And so, that I think this is just a beautiful conversation, and I hope that people who are listening will leave some comments. I think it's just the beginning of a very big conversation, but it's obviously, something we're going to continue covering in the Imperium Art project. So speaking of Imperium Art, let's move on to the segment where we ask our guests to respond to Nullis's essay on Imperium Art. If you could share your thoughts or notes on that, Joel.
Yeah, well, I mean, I mainly wanted to focus on this notion of the logos that he references. I mean, obviously influenced by Catholic theology, like Marcus Aurelius, he explicitly brings up. Sorry, not Aurelius. I'm confusing. Augustus, I think. Anyway,
was there?
Anyway, I forget the reference, but the point is that the notion of the logos.
Okay.
Now, I think this is related to what I was saying earlier about the drama, because drama versus rationalization, or dramatization versus rationalization, and this is like the one. I mean, I like the general sentiment that's given, but there's like kind of like you see this a lot on the right. This kind of anti-postmodernism. As someone who's read a decent amount of so-called postmodern theory, I don't actually believe that, you can see postmodernism in art quite clearly, but I don't think you can really like project that onto philosophy in the same way. So you have like the work of Jacques Derrida, who gets called a postmodernist, and then you kind of have this caricature of French theory in, the mid to late 20th century, as though it's all doing the same thing that Derrida was doing. I hate Derrida and his philosophy, but there's so much else going on here than just simply what he was doing. And so many interesting concepts that I think we can learn from and draw from. And I do promote the work of this guy on my channel, Gilles Deleuze, who I think is the great philosopher of this generation of French theorists. And he is not an anti-metaphysical thinker. He is doing metaphysics in an intense way, and kind of he is the great metaphysical thinker of the 20th century. I think possibly greater than Heidegger. If his work, Difference and Repetition, is this massive exposition that references the entire history of Western philosophy and engages in metaphysical discourse with all of the great thinkers in the Western tradition, which he sees himself very much as being a part of. And, there's a lot of ideas in his work, particularly his later work, which are very extreme left, that you see a lot of extreme leftists embracing. But there's also an incredible amount of Indo-European identitarianism that's kind of subtle in there, in my view, and a genuine participation in the Western tradition and the Neoplatonic tradition and so forth. So I think this is a figure that is kind of problematizes the whole caricature of what postmodernism is, because he violates all of its rules. And he draws a distinction in Difference and Repetition between the logos and the nomos, because he has this kind of critique of logos, essentially, this critique of Aristotle and Hegel are his main enemies. And I think this is very instructive for artists, because Hegel is a very complex thinker, but like in a nutshell, the Hegelian dialectical logic, it commits a fallacy, essentially, that Deleuze calls representationalism. Like his work is in many ways a critique of representationalism. So in order for the dialectic to function, you need to have these kind of definitional constructs that can be so that you have something to negate, because it kind of operates through negation. So you have you posit a construct like being, and then you can negate it with nothing, and then ultimately we need to kind of search for some kind of like synthetical relation between the negation and that which is being negated. And the problem with this is that in order for something to be, and so like the negative and negation drives Hegel's whole system. And Deleuze, being a Nietzschean, he rejects this and says, no, we need to have affirmation driving the system, because it doesn't kind of like, if your entire universe is composed out of subtraction, then you're not describing anything being created, and so you're describing nothing subtracting from nothing. You're not actually describing how anything is generated in the first place. And so he wants to create a philosophy of creation, and he says, so we need to have an affirmation, and so we can't posit something and negate it. Instead, we have to construct how we could posit something in the first place, before any kind of operation of negation can come in. And he says, so this is the representationalist fallacy. You take something represented, and you totally don't even describe the process of it being presented, its generation in the first place. And then you have this operation within language that, he says Hegel's philosophy moves via contradiction. And Deleuze wants to replace contradiction with difference, he says. A difference he uses in a very unique kind of metaphysical way. For Deleuze, difference is that which makes a difference. So any act of creation is making a difference, and it's making a difference. It's a becoming unto itself. And so he says, well, how is this possible for anything to actually become, or to how is it possible for difference in itself to express itself? And he says it can't kind of express itself according to pre-established rules. It can't express itself according to negating and contradicting that which is already established. And so it's improper to describe this as logos, because logos is ultimately grounded in the logic of ratio, in the logic of contradiction, comparison, countervailing, that are already presupposing identities that are already formed, and then they kind of act upon one another. Instead, we have to get to the formation, like the pre-identity formation, the difference that enables the identity to be different in the first place. And so, for this to occur, he needs to overthrow logos with nomos, with like the act of naming, the act of bringing forth the new, and so. But he also has a reverence for Plato, so he isn't just saying like new things just happen because they happen. Instead, he has this complex recasting of the Platonic idea. He says that the Platonic idea, in order for this whole, what I just described before, to occur, we have to really redesign what we think the Platonic idea is. And so he recasts the idea not as an identity that's kind of got a set definition, but instead as a complex theme. And so if you could look at the example of like punk rock as like a kind of colloquial example. So you could think of like the Ramones, the Dead Kennedys, Nirvana, and the Prodigy, for example, as like four expressions of the complex theme, the idea of punk. But they're all incredibly different bands, sounds. They come from different eras, and so they're all expressing an idea that is in one sense the same, but they're all every time that idea is to express itself, it has to express itself differently. And I can't think of anything more, like anything less punk, I should say, than just copying. Even though there's a lot of bands that do this, but it's like kind of like copying and pasting the sound. If you want to let's make a punk band and sound exactly like the Clash or something, it would be boring.
You're talking about like Green Day using a fake English accent while they sing or something like that.
Yeah. This is not punk, because punk is supposed to be about breaking the rules, creating a new form of expression, pushing the boundaries, and so forth. I think the bands I listed do this in their own unique ways, whatever you think of them. They are created quite unique sounds. And the point that I'm trying to kind of put forward is that, unlike in Hegel, where it's like we get stuck with a definition, we get stuck with liberalism or communism or socialism, and they have a set definition, a set meaning, and then they have to kind of contradict each other to kind of drive history. Instead, we can say, well, we don't actually need to keep kind of contradicting the fundamental themes of our situation to keep driving the discourse forward, because the act of interpreting and trying to dramatize and express any theme is always a creation of the new. The theme can it eternally returns as difference for Deleuze. So there's no, in order for the theme to return genuinely, it has to return differently. Otherwise, We aren't engaging in a kind of authentic expression of it. And it has this kind of internal complexity that is in principle infinite. So we could keep drawing new expressions and new forms out of the same perennial themes. And I think this is, I think, the artistic approach that we need to have, because if we want to be traditionalists and we want to say, okay, well, we want to reach back in the Western tradition and like kind of salvage ideas that have been lost or defiled and give them an expression. We also have to do it from the perspective of the 21st century and all of the kind of unique technological capabilities and sensibilities of our time. And so we are always kind of, whatever expression we create is not just a recapitulation of some old genre or some copying of some previous form, but it is something that has to be authentically new. And so I think this approach to thinking about things in terms of themes and drama, there's always a new drama of the same perennial theme. I think this enables us to kind of overcome the kind of the so-called the postmodernism, so to speak, of like a Derrida, who still engages in this representationalism and says, well, you know, the ideas are ultimately reducible to their definitions, and definitions are reducible to other definitions, and so we can never find some master definition that can bring meaning to all the different ideas. So we can throw and all the ideas out. We can problematize all the fundamental moral and metaphysical concepts of Western society. We can throw them all in the bin because they're all baseless. But the reason why this is a shit critique is because their basis is not in their definition. It's not in the linguistic expression, but it's in their complex theme, which is nowhere but everywhere. You know, you can the capacity to draw on it is not something that you can kind of get out in front of and model with language, because language is always attempting to represent themes that have already been presented aesthetically in this pre-representational, pre-linguistic mode.
Yeah, there's a lot to respond to. I would say that first off, like, capitalism has a role in, like, you know, reproducing old things, and it's you know, there's that. But I think the first thing that comes to mind is archaeofuturism as a style. You know, it is the style currently in our sphere. But I don't, as an art teacher and an artist, I feel like it's just the baby steps forward into creating a truly awoken sort of white art, I guess, if you will, or a new civilizational art, an Imperium Art. In that, you know, we're using old photos of Greek statues, etc., and then popping some Photoshop filters on them, and, you know, using the technology. To me, it's great, it's fine, but I feel like it's just the beginning, and I'm getting a little tired of it in a way. I really feel like anybody can kind of do that now. What's next? You know, Nullis, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, there's a few thoughts that, first of all, this was an excellent commentary on the essay, and I really appreciate it. And that's absolutely correct that language has its limitations. Language is it's an expression of the fallible human being. I mean, we can't expect perfection in language. It's just impossible. And I think that is definitely an important aspect that you brought up, Joel. And I think that's something that definitely adds more value to the whole Imperium Art project, and in terms of understanding what it is that we seek to achieve. And also the point about and I see this often, and I think that, you know, it's not necessarily the best approach to just say, let's forego the last 300 years or whatever, and let's go back to tradition, and, like, let's move out into the country, let's build castles, or let's I don't know, a homestead or whatever. And I'm not against people doing that, don't misunderstand me. But in terms of a civilizational level event, I think that will not bring us further on a civilizational level, at least. And I think that we must learn to understand the fact that we are in a ever geometrically evolving technological age. And so the problems and challenges we face, the moral challenges we face with this technological age, are not being contextualized properly. And that's definitely something that we need to address through our art and how we express ourselves. So we have to use our culture, and I prefer the continuity of our culture as opposed to a cyclical view of culture, or of history. But that's again, a detail. And I think that what's more important is we draw upon our past in order to understand our present and in order to provide context for our future. So we must incorporate the current year understanding of technology and how it implicates and impacts our daily lives, and how it can change our civilizations for the good or the bad, depending on us, how we can influence it. So these are all exceptionally great comments, Joel. So I really wanted to thank you for this.
Yeah, the key, like another notion to bring in to tie it into what I was saying earlier, is that what I see the role of the artist is to read new implications into the themes that we're already inhabiting.
Mm-hmm.
So that like Heidegger describes this as well, that ultimately like the horizon of the future within the consciousness of Dasein, to use his terminology, is ultimately constructed is ultimately revealed in our relation with our historicity and our past. Yeah. And so if you think about in your own personal life, any act of maturing where you kind of come to a new kind of awareness, self-discipline, self-understanding, is ultimately having like a new reading of your past, of your life history. Like, mm-hmm. you rationalized your behavior in a certain way and then realized, wait a second, you have a whole new perspective on how you're acting, maybe like the way that, your relationships with other people or whatever. And you go through a kind of an awakening to a new potential in how you could be. And right. This is, I think, what is needed on a civilizational scale. Like, we have to kind of read new things into our own history and into yes. and into our kind of shared constitution of who we are. Like, what does masculinity mean? What does whiteness mean, and so forth? And these are very open and fertile questions that there's many different ways you can read into them. And I think I think you guys as artists already have this kind of intuitive, any artist would have a kind of intuitive kind of embrace of this kind of notion, because usually all great art does this, where all great art is always kind of like a response to a previous form of art. A previous form of art is kind of like reading something into the world. Like, if you read all the different manifestos of all like the 19th century mm-hmm. forms of painting, they're always kind of arguing for a different perspective on the same on some kind of perennial theme that the previous mode was trying to express. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a very generative, fertile mentality to have, that like not so much because we have this overbearing sense, like I mentioned with the capitalist realism thing, that our society, as you said, sci-fi is just dystopian. We just have this overbearing sense that we have this inability to create anything new, and this kind of cultural exhaustion that is kind of like set in. We're not. Yeah, and the exhaustion is spiritual, and it's expressing itself out. We're not reproducing with our families. All our institutions are stagnating. It's happening across the board, across the whole civilization. Yep. And so the only way that we can revive ourselves is not through throwing everything in the bin and saying, well, that was a mistake, we need to start again from scratch, is instead to kind of read new potentials into what's already there and say, well, there's potential all around us for new modes of creativity, if only someone would just have the eyes to see them, but they're right there, imminent in the present moment. So
that's I'm sorry, go ahead, Donald. I'm sorry.
Oh, I apologize. No, I'm just saying that you've really set the bar, and you've put the target very clearly out there for artists and others. But go ahead, Nolis.
No, I just wanted to underscore what Joel said. I think that we need to build upon our experience. We need to understand ourselves first. We need to understand and not overly romanticize ourselves either. And I think that I mean this in the most how should I say, the most polite manner. I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't find glory in our past. I find glory in our past. I think that our ancestors were glorious people. But what I am saying is that for ourselves, we should not romanticize it and say that, well, we have to build upon it, is what we have to do. So maybe the better analogy would be that we're the generation that has to build that next level of the cathedral, if you want to use that analogy. And instead of us looking at everything that has been built around us and saying, oh, how glorious all of this is, we want this. No, our job is to build that next level. We have to build the steeple to the cathedral. That's our job. And so we have to continue this process. By continuing this process, we're honoring our ancestors, and we're honoring their glory. That's the way I would maybe try to summarize it.
And also expressing that any kind of great act of art that is done in the 2020s, in whatever medium, will stand as an expression that there is still creative possibility, that there's still more to say, that the West has more to say, and that unique to say, and so it isn't just about even just the individual thing you're expressing, but the larger reality that we're not dead yet. Our spirit is still alive.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we'll envision the new cathedral
not the new cathedral. It's the same cathedral. We're just building upon the cathedral. Our generation is tasked to build that next level, and that's what we have to do.
Yeah, this is where we diverge. I think that you have a concept to build on. I have a concept to build on, but where they're based on the same theme. And that's the key, obviously, and we should have some kind of artistic diversity as well too. But so any closing thoughts, Joel?
Just that I think this is the question that I'm exploring in my personal life, because I was raised a Christian, kind of lost faith in my teens. But took it very seriously when I was a kid. It was a very serious thing in my family at that time. And it was kind of the experience of, I was never converted. It was just it's just what the truth was. I was just immersed in Christianity, and that was just how it was, and that's that. And I've gone through this process of, finding all these intellectual critiques of Christianity and feeling a kind of distance from Christianity for various different reasons, exploring different religious expressions, wanting to return to a more, at least I thought, more authentically European paganism. I listened a little bit to you guys talking to Dave Martell.
Great.
And, there's other great figures like Survive the Jive and a few other YouTubers that really do explore this theme of Anglo-Saxon paganism and Indo-European paganism in general, and the work of Georges Dumézil and various other authors on this subject I find very interesting. And so I went through this process of trying to kind of come to terms with this modality, but lately I've been feeling convicted to start returning to Christianity in a very in a way I didn't expect, and in a very visceral way, due to this kind of fundamental, just looking around me at the moral mess of the people around me, including in my own life in a certain degree, and saying I don't really see any other path to the divinity being realized in these people's lives except through a pretty large helping of forgiveness and grace that they probably don't deserve. And the figure of Christ really does seem to be relevant to our current situation more than ever, particularly the situation of normal people, and also looking into the history of law and economics, and how the secularization of these disciplines ultimately led to all of these destructive tendencies in liberalism. It really is making me respect Christianity, and also this idea as well that my personal religion, the idea that I can have a personal religion, is such a liberal, modern, nihilistic idea. So I can choose my religion as if it's like a fashion, or a an excessive. I'm going to have Chinese food tonight, or I'm going to get really into craft beer or something. It's that's not what a religion is. A religion, for the vast majority of human beings in world history, religion was never a choice.
No,
your people just had a religion, and that was that, and you just were raised in it, and that's how I felt when I was a kid, a young child as well, because of my upbringing. And it is actually a great shame that it even is a choice. It really should just be a destiny. It should just be,
Wow.
it should just be given to you by your forefathers, and this is this, and there's no debate on the subject.
That's
And
powerful.
so my view is, okay, I can't just find a personal religion that's good for me. Maybe I might find something personally interesting in Zen Buddhism or something, and I do, or in uh, Anglo-Saxon paganism. But ultimately, these are not traditions that my people are able to share
Sure.
in a fundamental way. Only tradition available that could actually be shared on the social scale is Christianity, whether you like that or not. I don't see a coherent argument for anything else. Anglo-Saxon paganism is interesting, but doesn't even have any texts that are like, you have to read like the Vedas or Christians
Yeah.
writing at the time about it through second person.
Sure.
It's unfortunate because it is obviously a part of our people's history, and I think
Yes.
we do really need to take it seriously
Yes.
and look into it and try and revive it as a body of knowledge,
Mhm.
and it can inspire us. But ultimately, that tradition is broken, and there is a religion that is there for people whose traditions are broken, and that's Christianity. Because the whole point of Christianity is Christ comes into the life of an individual who is kind of abstracted and alienated from his ancestral cults, from his relation to God, and it's a redemption and a bringing home back to relation with divinity of someone who has lost that relation, and that is exactly the position Western society is in. So
Mhm.
I'm starting to get a lot more sympathetic and towards Christianity as a worldview. But I think this is a discussion that we need to have openly. And I'm not anti-pagan either, because I really can sympathize with pagan sympathy, because I have it and had it. And so I think we need to. I think in our movement we have these like diverging trends. Of it's like a massive Christian faction. It has its own internal differences, and then all of these kind of
Mm-hmm.
pagan, more sympathetic towards paganism in a kind of loose sense factions. Um, I think we need to have a discussion about how to kind of share a spirituality with one another in a really rigorous and complete sense, because only on that basis will we have the kind of moral fortitude and brotherhood uh, to actually propose something that could lead society. And because if ultimately we're all engaged in this internal difference, and we don't want to touch the subject of religion because it's alienating us,
Mhm.
this is not spiritual leadership. And ultimately that's the basis upon which our movement would have any hope of attaining rule, would be that we're trying to realign the civilization with
Mm.
with uh, with the shared conception of the divine, and on the basis of that authority,
Mhm.
give moral and political prescriptions. So.
It's been a very, very profound episode, and we're extremely grateful to you for joining us. There's obviously a lot more to say, but I think that we've covered so much ground and we've accomplished so much. And again, we're just very grateful for your gifts. Everything that you're able to process and bring to this. To the table, and so I'm really excited about future discussions with you and other people in our sphere about all of these themes. So I'd like to wrap up the show by letting people know where they can find you and follow you. You want to go ahead
Yeah,
with that?
this is going up on YouTube, right? So maybe you could link my YouTube channel in the description.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And yeah, so the Imperium Cast 1 aforementioned, that was only released a couple of days ago. In the video description, on because I posted it on my YouTube channel as well as various other platforms, you'll find a link to a Discord server that I run, that you can find, Mike and I's main friends in, and like you can establish relations. You can find me on Twitter as well. Maybe you could link my Twitter. So if you want to like talk to me about something, these are the places where you can find me most easily, I think.
Wonderful. Again, thanks so much for joining us. And again,
Yes, thank
thanks so
you.
much. Yeah, for Nullis and all his contributions between the three of us. I think like I said, we've accomplished so much tonight. So again, to the viewers, listeners, subscribe, share, comment, get involved. And thank you so much for spending your time with us. Take care.